In the far reaches of the South Pacific, scattered islands rise from deep water. Many are inhabited. Some support villages that have existed for centuries. Others remain largely untouched, their cliffs and forests shaped only by wind, rain, and the slow movement of the sea. One such place lies roughly 100 kilometers south of Tonga's main island group. The island is called Ata. From a distance, it appears as a steep volcanic mass, rising abruptly from the ocean. Dark cliffs face the open Pacific. Dense vegetation covers the interior slopes. Waves strike the rock walls below with steady force. For long periods of its history, Ata held a small Polynesian community. Archaeological evidence shows that families once farmed the island's slopes. Stone terraces and planting grounds were built along the hillsides. But by the mid-19th century, that community disappeared after a slave raid carried off most of its inhabitants. After that, the island was never permanently resettled. By the 1960s, Ata was uninhabited. No harbor welcomed passing boats. No lighthouse marked its position. Fishing vessels occasionally moved through the surrounding waters, but few had reason to approach the steep coastline. From most angles, landing on the island looked difficult. Vegetation slowly reclaimed the abandoned terraces. Birds nested along the cliffs. Wild plants grew across the ridges where houses had once stood. For decades, the island remained quiet. Then, in June of 1965, 6 boys from the Tongan capital would arrive there unexpectedly, carried not by intention, but by the open ocean. In the mid-1960s, the Kingdom of Tonga remained a small and closely connected island nation. Life moved at a steady pace. Families relied on farming, fishing, and church communities that structured much of daily life. The capital city, Nuku'alofa, stood on the island of Tongatapu, where schools, government offices, and the country's main port were located. Among the students attending a Catholic boarding school in Nuku'alofa were 6 teenage boys who had become close friends. Their names were Sione Fatawa, Kolo Fekitoa, Mano Totau, Tevita Siola, Luke Vekoso, and Stephen Tevita. They ranged in age from roughly 13 to 16. Like many students living under the discipline of a boarding school, their days followed a strict routine: morning prayers, classroom lessons, assigned chores, supervision by teachers and priests. Life was structured and predictable. Outside school grounds, however, the islands of Tonga offered a very different environment. The surrounding ocean shaped everyday life. Fishing boats left the harbor before dawn. Children grew up familiar with reefs, tides, and coastal winds. Stories of long voyages and seafaring ancestors were part of local culture. The 6 boys shared a curiosity about the sea beyond their home island. During conversations between classes and in the dormitory at night, they talked about sailing away for a short adventure. The idea was not entirely unusual among teenagers living in an island nation. Boats were common. Short fishing trips happened every day. At some point in June of 1965, the boys made a decision. They would take a small fishing boat and spend time at sea. Their plan, according to later accounts, was simple: travel away from the harbor, catch fish, and return before anyone noticed their absence. It was meant to be brief. The boat they chose belonged to a local fisherman. It was a small, open vessel, typical of those used around the islands. It had a sail and limited supplies on board. The boys did not bring extensive equipment. They expected to be away only a short time. On the evening they left Nuku'alofa, conditions on the water appeared manageable. Coastal weather in the South Pacific can shift quickly, but nothing at that moment suggested immediate danger. The 6 boys pushed the boat away from shore and began sailing. For teenagers seeking a small escape from routine, the trip likely felt like a moment of independence. The lights of the capital slowly faded behind them as the boat moved into darker water. Night arrived over the Pacific. What followed would change the course of their lives and carry them far beyond the journey they had imagined. After leaving the harbor of Nuku'alofa, the boys sailed into the open water surrounding Tongatapu. Their plan had been simple. They would travel some distance offshore, fish for a short time, and return before morning. The small vessel they had taken was not intended for long voyages. It was designed for coastal work, where land remained visible and weather could be watched carefully. At first, the journey followed their expectations. The shoreline lights grew faint behind them. The night air was warm, and the ocean surface moved with the slow rhythm common in calm tropical waters. Sometime during the night, conditions began to change. Wind increased across the water. In the darkness, waves rose higher than before. The small boat was not equipped with an engine powerful enough to counter strong currents. The boys had also dropped anchor earlier in the night to keep the vessel from drifting. During the worsening weather, the anchor line snapped. Once that rope broke, the boat lost its only reliable hold against the movement of the sea. Wind and current began carrying it farther from land. With limited experience navigating in deep water and no functioning motor to control their direction, the boys were unable to return toward Tongatapu. By morning, the coastline was no longer visible. What followed was a long and uncertain drift. The small boat moved across the open Pacific under shifting winds. Food on board was minimal. Fresh water was almost non-existent. The boys relied on rain when it fell, collecting drops wherever they could. Hunger and thirst quickly became constant conditions. According to later accounts, the boat remained adrift for about 8 days. During that time, the boys saw nothing but ocean in every direction. The Pacific is vast, and a small wooden vessel can disappear easily among its waves. For long stretches, there were no ships nearby and no visible islands. Then, after more than a week at sea, a dark shape appeared on the horizon. It was land. The drifting boat had reached the cliffs of Ata, a remote island that had stood empty for decades. When the drifting boat reached the cliffs of Ata, the boys faced their first immediate challenge: landing. Ata rises sharply from the sea. Much of its coastline is made of steep volcanic rock, where waves break directly against the cliffs. There are few places where a small vessel can safely approach shore. The boys maneuvered the damaged boat along the coastline, searching for a section where the water appeared calmer. Eventually, they reached an area where the cliffs lowered slightly. There, they abandoned the boat and climbed onto the rocks. The ascent was difficult. The island's outer slopes are covered with dense vegetation and uneven terrain. Sharp coral and volcanic stone made movement slow and careful. After 8 days drifting at sea with almost no supplies, they had finally reached land. The first days were spent exploring the immediate area. The boys moved cautiously across the slopes, trying to understand where they had arrived and what resources might exist. At first glance, the island seemed wild and untouched. Thick plant growth covered the hillsides. Birds circled the cliffs. The sound of waves carried constantly upward from the shoreline. But as they explored farther inland, they noticed signs that people had once lived there. Stone terraces appeared along the slopes. These structures had been built long before to create flat ground for planting crops. Though partly covered by vegetation, their shapes remained visible. Paths, now narrow and overgrown, connected some of the terraces together. These discoveries revealed something important. The island might be abandoned, but it had once supported human life. For the boys, this suggested that survival there might be possible. Food became their first priority. During their exploration, they found several plants that still grew across the terraces. Wild taro, bananas, and coconuts appeared in scattered areas. These were likely descendants of crops planted by the island's former residents many decades earlier. Seabirds also nested on the cliffs. By observing the birds and moving carefully along the rocky slopes, the boys began collecting eggs. Occasionally, they were able to catch the birds themselves. These became an additional source of food. Water was more difficult. The island had no easily accessible streams near their landing area. Fresh water depended largely on rainfall. To solve this problem, the boys used hollow sections of wood and natural depressions in the rock to collect rainwater whenever storms passed over the island. Once they secured basic food and water sources, attention shifted to shelter. The climate in the South Pacific is generally warm, but the island still experienced heavy rain and strong wind. Exposure to the elements would become dangerous over long periods. The boys gathered branches, palm leaves, and other vegetation to construct simple shelters. Using driftwood and fallen tree limbs, they built structures that protected them from wind and rain. Palm leaves layered across the roof created a barrier against storms. The shelters were basic but functional. Over time, they improved them. What allowed the group to endure was the way they organized themselves. Rather than acting individually, the boys established a cooperative routine. Tasks were divided among them. Some searched for food, others maintained the shelter area. Another group remained responsible for maintaining a fire. Fire became one of the most important elements of their survival. At some point early in their time on the island, the boys managed to start a flame. Historical accounts suggest that they used friction methods or materials salvaged from their boat, though the exact method is uncertain. Once the fire existed, they treated it as something that could not be lost. They kept the fire burning continuously. Even when they slept, someone ensured that embers remained alive. Maintaining that flame provided warmth, allowed them to cook food, and offered a signal that could potentially be seen by passing ships. The fire remained active throughout their entire stay on the island. Daily life gradually developed into a pattern. Morning hours often began with checking water supplies and searching for food. Eggs were gathered from the cliffs. Fruits were collected from trees growing along the terraces. Occasionally, birds were caught using simple traps or by hand along nesting areas. Afternoons were spent improving their living space. They cleared vegetation around their shelters to create open ground. Additional structures were built for storing food and wood. The terraces left by earlier inhabitants were partially restored to grow some of the plants they had discovered. These efforts transformed their small camp into a more stable environment. Tools were limited, but the boys adapted using what they could find. Pieces of wood were shaped into digging sticks. Sharp stones were used for cutting tasks. Coconut shells and large leaves served as containers. Despite the isolation, the group maintained a level of discipline. According to later interviews, they created an agreement among themselves to avoid conflict. Disagreements were handled by separating individuals temporarily, rather than allowing arguments to grow. In such a small group, cooperation became essential. This approach helped prevent serious disputes. In addition to practical work, the boys also developed activities to occupy time. Long periods of isolation can place pressure on a person's mental stability. To counter this, they created simple routines beyond survival tasks. One example involved music. Using materials from the island, they built a crude instrument resembling a guitar. The strings were improvised, and the sound was limited, but it allowed them to sing together during the evenings. They also prayed regularly. Growing up in Tonga, religious practice had been a part of daily life. Continuing those habits gave structure to their days. As weeks turned into months, the boys' survival system became more refined. The terraces provided food. The fire remained constant. Rainwater was collected and stored carefully. Shelter protected them from storms. Physical health fluctuated depending on food availability and weather conditions. But overall, the group managed to remain active. What is notable about their time on Ata is that they did not simply wait for rescue. They worked continuously to maintain the environment around them. Paths were cleared across the hillside connecting important areas. The shelter, food terraces, water collection points, and the cliffs where birds nested. These paths made movement easier and safer, especially during rain when the slopes became slippery. The island slowly transformed from an unknown wilderness into a place the boys understood. Months passed in this way. The ocean surrounding Ata remained largely empty. Cargo ships and fishing boats occasionally moved through the region, but the island's steep cliffs made it difficult to see activity from the water unless smoke or movement appeared above the ridges. For long stretches of time, the boys saw no other humans. Yet the systems they built, fire, shelter, food gathering, and cooperation, allowed them to continue living on the island far longer than anyone might have expected when their boat first drifted onto the rocks. As the months passed on Ata, the systems the boys had built allowed them to survive. But stability on the island was never complete. The environment remained unpredictable, and the physical demands of daily life continued to test them. Weather was one of the most constant pressures. The South Pacific can shift quickly between calm and violent conditions. Storms moved across the ocean with little warning. When heavy rain arrived, the steep slopes of Ata became slick and dangerous. Wind pushed against their shelters and scattered loose materials around the camp. During stronger storms, the boys stayed close to their shelters and protected the fire as carefully as possible. Losing it would have forced them to begin again, under difficult conditions. Even when rain poured through the vegetation, they kept embers alive beneath layers of ash and wood. Food supply also changed with the seasons. Some weeks brought an abundance of bird, eggs, and fruit. Other periods were more limited. The boys continued gathering wild taro and bananas growing along the old terraces left by earlier inhabitants. Seabirds nesting on the cliffs remained a regular source of food, though reaching them required careful climbing across steep rock faces. One of the most serious incidents occurred during routine work on the island. At some point during their stay, Stephen Tavita fell from a height while moving along the rocky terrain. The fall resulted in a broken leg. On an isolated island without medical supplies, such an injury could easily have ended the group's chances of survival. The other boys responded by adapting their routines. They constructed a splint using wooden branches and materials available in their camp. Movement for Stephen became limited while the bone healed. During this period, the others carried additional responsibilities for gathering food and maintaining shelter. According to later accounts, the group remained patient and supportive throughout his recovery. Over time, the injury healed well enough for him to walk again. Physical exhaustion was another challenge that gradually accumulated. Daily tasks required climbing steep terrain, carrying wood, and traveling long distances across the island in search of food. Cuts, bruises, and minor infections were likely common, though detailed records of every illness do not exist. More difficult to measure was the effect of time itself. The boys had no calendar. Days blended together through repetition of the same routines. Weather patterns shifted, and seasons passed quietly. At times, they climbed high points on the island to watch the horizon for ships, but weeks often went by without seeing anything beyond open ocean. By early 1966, the group had been isolated for well over a year. Their shelters still stood. The fire continued to burn. The terraces provided food, but the distance between them and the outside world remained vast. Then, during the month of September 1966, a fishing vessel moved through the waters near Ata. On board was an Australian captain named Peter Warner. From the deck of his boat, he noticed something unusual rising above the island's cliffs. It was smoke. In September 1966, the Australian fishing vessel operated by Peter Warner moved through the waters south of Tonga. Warner was the son of a wealthy Australian family and had established a fishing business in the region. His boat regularly traveled across the South Pacific in search of fishing grounds. While sailing near Ata, Warner noticed something unexpected rising from the cliffs above the shoreline. Smoke. The island was known to be uninhabited. Seeing smoke suggested that someone or something was there. Curious, Warner directed the vessel closer to the island to investigate. As the boat approached the cliffs, movement appeared along the rocks above the water. At first, the shapes were difficult to distinguish against the dark vegetation. Then several figures began climbing down toward the shoreline. They were thin and sun-darkened, moving carefully across the steep terrain. When the group reached the lower rocks, they called out toward the fishing vessel. Their voices carried across the water. Warner and his crew listened as the boys explained that they had been stranded on the island for many months. Communication between the groups took some time. Warner later contacted Radio Tonga to confirm the story. Authorities in Nuku'alofa verified that 6 boys from a Catholic boarding school had been missing since June 1965. The news confirmed that the figures on the cliffs were the same students who had disappeared more than a year earlier. Warner brought the boys aboard his vessel. After 15 months on the island, their time on Ata had come to an end. After leaving Ata, the fishing vessel carrying the 6 boys returned toward Tonga. News of their survival moved quickly through the islands. For more than a year, families and school authorities had believed the boys were lost at sea. When they arrived back in Nuku'alofa, the story was confirmed. The 6 students who had disappeared in June 1965 had survived 15 months on an uninhabited island. Their accounts of terraces, birds, rainwater, and a continuously maintained fire matched the conditions later observed on the island. The event attracted attention beyond Tonga. Observers noted how the boys had organized themselves cooperatively, sharing work and maintaining routines over a long period of isolation. Their experience stood in contrast to many castaway narratives centered on conflict or collapse. Instead, the survival of Sione Fatawa and his companions showed how discipline, cooperation, and steady effort could sustain life even in remote conditions. Today, Ata remains largely quiet. The terraces still rest beneath its vegetation, overlooking the same ocean that once carried 6 drifting boys to its shore.